I stood beside my birthday cake, 70 candles flickering in the dim ballroom light. The champagne bubbled in crystal glasses. My children smiled at me with faces I thought I knew. Then the projector clicked on, and my world shifted. My son Oliver's voice filled the room through hidden speakers. Effective immediately, my mother will step down as CEO of Russo Industries. The recorded message played like a funeral announcement. My daughter Camille stood behind me, her hand on my shoulder like a executioner's touch. The room fell silent. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Board members shifted in their seats, eyes darting between me and my children. I felt the weight of 300 guests watching my humiliation unfold. But here's what they didn't know. I had been expecting this moment for months. Every late-night whisper, every secret meeting, every forged document, I knew about it all. As the recording continued, laying out their plans to remove me from my own company, I felt something they never expected. Relief. Because tonight, my dear children were about to learn that their mother didn't build a $350 million empire by being naive. The words slipped from my lips in a whisper that somehow carried across the silent ballroom. "You greedy little vultures." I said it so quietly that only the people closest to me heard it. But in that thick silence, it might as well have been shouted. Oliver cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Mother, this is for your own good. The company needs fresh leadership." Camille nodded, her designer dress catching the light as she moved to stand beside her brother. My youngest son Marcus joined them, forming a wall of betrayal. The press cameras that Camille had secretly invited began flashing. She'd planned this as a public spectacle, ensuring I couldn't fight back without looking like a bitter old woman clinging to power. I watched my children's smug faces, so certain of their victory. They'd practiced this moment, rehearsed their lines, prepared for my tears and protests. What they hadn't prepared for was my smile. "Are you finished?" I asked, my voice steady as granite. The question seemed to confuse them. Oliver glanced at Camille, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. That's when I knew I had them exactly where I wanted them. Let me tell you who I am. My name is Diane Russo, and I built Russo Industries from nothing. 45 years ago, I started with a dusty garage, one client, and a dream that seemed impossible to everyone except me. I was 25, recently widowed, with 3 young children and bills I couldn't pay. My husband had left us with debt and broken promises. The world told me to find a nice office job, maybe remarry someone stable. Instead, I chose to build something that would never leave my children vulnerable, the way their father's death had left us. I started small, manufacturing specialized parts for electronics companies. I worked 18-hour days, learning accounting, sales, engineering, and everything else by trial and error. My children grew up in that garage, doing homework while I welded and calculated and dreamed bigger. By the time they were teenagers, we had our first factory. By the time they graduated college, we had 3. When they turned 30, Russo Industries was worth $100 million. I gave them everything. The best schools, unlimited opportunities, positions in the company they never earned. I thought I was being a good mother. I was creating monsters. The entitlement started small. Private tutors when they struggled with schoolwork instead of extra effort. New cars when they crashed the old ones instead of consequences. Trust funds that removed any need to work hard for anything. I told myself I was giving them the security I never had. But security without struggle creates weakness. Privilege without purpose creates poison. Oliver joined the company at 25 with a corner office and a salary that took me 15 years to earn. Camille came aboard as head of marketing, despite never having worked anywhere else. Marcus got the overseas division, even though he'd never lived outside our city. They attended board meetings like royalty holding court. They made decisions that affected thousands of employees without understanding the weight of responsibility. They spent company money like it was their personal allowance. The worst part? They resented me for it. Every success I achieved, every milestone we reached, somehow became evidence that I was stealing their rightful place in the world. When Oliver turned 40 last year, he told me, "You've had your time, Mother, now it's ours." I should have seen the writing on the wall then. Instead, I hoped my children would grow into their roles. I was still hoping, right up until tonight. Camille was always the most dangerous, beautiful, charming, and absolutely ruthless when she wanted something. She could smile while sliding a knife between your ribs, and you'd thank her for the privilege. She handled our public relations with the skill of a master manipulator. Board members who questioned her decisions found themselves facing damaging rumors. Employees who challenged her authority discovered their positions suddenly eliminated. She once told me over dinner, "You won't be around forever, Mother. Someone needs to prepare for the future." At the time, I thought she meant succession planning. Now I understood she meant replacement planning. Camille had been working behind the scenes for 2 years, building alliances and gathering support. She convinced board members that I was losing my mental sharpness. She planted stories with business journalists about my erratic decisions. She even hired consultants to analyze our company structure and recommend improvements. Every improvement pointed toward the same conclusion: Diane Rousseau needed to step aside. She orchestrated tonight's coup with the precision of a military operation. The recorded announcement, the press presence, the timing during my birthday celebration when I'd be emotionally vulnerable and off guard. Camille had thought of everything, except for one small detail that would destroy her completely. In 2017, we revised our corporate bylaws. It was routine legal maintenance, the kind of paperwork that makes eyes glaze over during board meetings. Page after page of technical language that nobody bothered to read carefully. Hidden in Section 12, Subsection 4, Paragraph 3, I had inserted a clause that seemed insignificant at the time. It stated that all executive transitions required my final signature, non-transferable, irrevocable, sole authority. My lawyers had suggested it as protection against hostile takeovers. I approved it, thinking about outside threats, never imagining the threat would come from inside my own family. The clause meant that no matter what votes were taken, what announcements were made, or what press conferences were held, I remained CEO until I personally signed the transfer documents. And those documents had to be signed in the presence of 3 independent witnesses and notarized. My children's coup was legally meaningless. They could make all the recordings they wanted, hold all the meetings they pleased, but without my signature, they had no power at all. I had written that clause 5 years ago and forgotten about it. But 3 months ago, when I first suspected their betrayal, my lawyer reminded me of that small detail. It was about to become the biggest detail of their lives. The betrayal wasn't limited to my children. They had recruited allies throughout the company, promising promotions and power once I was removed. My CFO, William, had been with us for 8 years. I'd trusted him with our financial strategy, our expansion plans, our most confidential information. He'd been meeting secretly with Oliver for months, preparing budgets that excluded me from decision-making. My head of legal, Patricia, had drafted the succession documents they planned to use tonight. She'd researched ways to declare me mentally incompetent, investigated my personal finances for irregularities, and prepared legal challenges to my authority. Even my godson, Anthony, had joined their conspiracy. I'd hired him fresh from business school, mentored him personally, treated him like a 4th child. He'd been feeding them inside information about my meetings, my decisions, my private conversations. Each betrayal cut deeper than the last. These weren't just employees plotting against their boss. These were people I'd considered family, people I'd supported through divorces and illnesses and career setbacks. I started keeping a notebook, recording every whispered conversation I overheard, every suspicious glance exchanged in meetings, every small sign that my own company was being turned against me. That notebook was about to become very important. 3 weeks ago, I heard them talking in the wine cellar at my estate. Oliver and Marcus were selecting bottles for a client dinner, their voices echoing off the stone walls. "Once she's out, we liquidate the R&D division immediately," Oliver said, his voice sharp with impatience. "That's $30 million we can distribute to shareholders instead of wasting on her pet projects." Marcus laughed, a sound that chilled me to the bone. Finally. All that money thrown away on innovation and future planning? We could have bought another yacht with what she spent last year. The R&D division was my late husband's dream. Before he died, We'd talked about creating new technologies that could change the world. That division had developed 3 breakthrough patents that would revolutionize manufacturing within the next decade. They wanted to sell it for quick cash. Standing in the darkness above the cellar, listening to my son's plan to destroy their father's legacy, I felt something inside me crystallize into cold, hard determination. They would never touch the R&D division. They would never touch any part of what we'd built. And they would never get the chance to destroy 45 years of work for a temporary profit. That was the moment I decided they needed to be stopped completely. My ex-husband's sister, Lorraine, had always been an unusual woman. She'd spent 30 years as a CIA analyst, specializing in domestic surveillance and intelligence gathering. She'd retired to a quiet cottage outside the city, but her skills hadn't dulled with age. She owed me a favor from years ago, when I'd helped her through a difficult divorce. When I called her 3 months ago, she listened to my concerns with professional interest. Family betrayals are often the most dangerous, she said, her voice calm as still water. They know your weaknesses, your routines, your blind spots, but they also underestimate your strengths. Within a week, she'd installed surveillance equipment throughout my home and office, tiny cameras and microphones that were invisible to the naked eye but recorded everything. Every secret meeting, every whispered conversation, every planning session my children held. She also ran background checks on everyone involved in the conspiracy. Financial records, personal communications, travel schedules, she assembled a complete picture of their activities. The evidence we gathered was devastating. Embezzlement, insider trading, breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy to commit fraud. My children hadn't just planned to remove me. They'd been stealing from the company for months to fund their lifestyle. Lorraine handed me a thick folder 3 days before my birthday. "Everything you need," she said with a satisfied smile. My children's first strategic mistake was underestimating my mental capacity. They spread rumors that I was developing dementia, that my decision-making had become erratic, that I was no longer fit to lead the company. They even filed legal documents requesting a competency evaluation, claiming they were concerned about my health and the company's welfare. The irony was breathtaking. They were trying to have me declared mentally unfit while simultaneously plotting to commit multiple felonies. But I had advantages they didn't know about. My personal physician, Dr. Anderson, had been treating me for 15 years. He'd conducted comprehensive cognitive tests just 6 months earlier as part of my annual physical. The results showed my mental acuity was still sharp as a surgical blade. More importantly, Dr. Anderson was outraged when he learned about their claims. He volunteered to testify on my behalf, providing detailed medical records that would demolish their competency challenge. I also underwent additional testing with 2 independent specialists, creating an ironclad medical record of my mental fitness. When their lawyers tried to present their case in court, the judge took one look at the evidence and dismissed their petition with prejudice. That was their second mistake. The first was thinking I wouldn't fight back. The third mistake was trusting people who could be bought. They scheduled a secret board meeting for the Monday after my birthday, intending to formalize my removal while I was still reeling from their public ambush. The meeting was called for 9 a.m. in the executive conference room. I arrived at 8. Lorraine accompanied me, along with my personal attorney and a court stenographer. We set up equipment and waited. When the board members began arriving, they found me sitting calmly at the head of the table, reviewing documents. The confusion on their faces was priceless. Oliver and Camille arrived last, confident and smug, right up until they saw me. The color drained from Camille's face so quickly I thought she might faint. "Good morning," I said pleasantly. "I believe we have some business to discuss." I played the recordings we'd gathered over the past 3 months. Conversations about removing me, plans to liquidate valuable divisions, discussions about personal financial gain. The room grew quieter with each revelation. When I finished, I set a thick folder on the table. "These are signed affidavits from 17 employees detailing the harassment and intimidation they experienced when they refused to support your conspiracy." 3 board members resigned on the spot, mumbling apologies as they fled the room. The remaining members sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the scope of what my children had attempted. Camille tried one final desperate play. She'd discovered evidence of an affair I'd had 15 years earlier. During a particularly difficult period in my marriage, she had photographs, emails, hotel receipts, everything needed to create a scandal. She called me the night after the board meeting, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Mother, I think we can work something out. You step down quietly, and these materials never see the light of day." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the phone. "Release them," I said. "Please, the world loves a woman with a past." Her silence stretched for nearly a minute. She'd expected shame, fear, desperate bargaining. Instead, she got amusement and indifference. "You're bluffing," she finally whispered. "Try me," I replied. "I lived through that affair, survived the guilt, and came out stronger. Do you really think some old photographs can hurt me now?" She never released the materials. Years later, I learned she'd paid a private investigator $20,000 to gather that evidence. It was money she could have saved if she'd understood that shame only has power when you give it power. I'd stopped being ashamed of my imperfections decades ago. It was one of the many advantages of reaching 70 with a clear conscience about the things that actually mattered. Carlos had been my estate manager for 12 years. Quiet, observant, and completely loyal, he managed my household staff and maintained my properties with meticulous care. What my children never realized was that Carlos saw and heard everything. He witnessed their secret meetings in my study. He overheard their phone conversations in the garden. He watched them search through my personal papers when they thought I was traveling. For months, he'd been keeping detailed records of their activities, not because I asked him to, but because his instincts told him something was wrong. The day after the failed board meeting, Carlos knocked on my office door. "Mrs. Rousseau," he said in his formal way, "I have some things I think you should see." He presented me with a leather portfolio containing photographs, written observations, and audio recordings he'd made using his personal phone. Everything was dated and time-stamped with the precision of a man who understood the importance of evidence. His testimony would be devastating in court. But more importantly, his loyalty reminded me that not everyone in my life was plotting against me. Some people still understood the meaning of honor and dedication. I gave him a raise that day, and a bonus, and a promise that his job would be secure for as long as he wanted it. My personal attorney, Margaret Sullivan, had been preparing for this moment since I first confided my suspicions 3 months earlier. She'd assembled a legal team that worked with the thoroughness of archaeologists, uncovering layer after layer of my children's criminal activities. The dossier she presented was 2 inches thick and absolutely damning. Bank records showing unauthorized transfers from company accounts to personal investments. Email chains discussing the manipulation of stock prices through selective information leaks. Meeting notes outlining plans to sell company assets and distribute the proceeds among conspirators. "This isn't just corporate misconduct," Margaret explained as we reviewed the evidence. "This is systematic fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit theft. The SEC will have enough here to file criminal charges." She'd also documented their attempts to undermine my mental competency claims, their harassment of employees who refused to cooperate, and their breach of fiduciary duties as corporate officers. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened an investigation within 48 hours of receiving our complaint. Federal prosecutors began reviewing the evidence for criminal charges. Banking regulators started examining their personal financial transactions. My children had spent months planning my downfall. They'd never considered that their actions might lead to their own destruction. The legal avalanche was just beginning. I rewrote my will on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks after my birthday catastrophe. It wasn't an act of revenge, though I'm sure my children saw it that way. It was an act of clarity. Everything I'd built would now go to the people and causes that had earned it. The employees who'd worked loyally for decades would receive substantial bonuses and secure pensions. The research foundation my husband had dreamed of would get endowment funding to continue developing life-changing technologies, educational scholarships for disadvantaged students, environmental conservation projects, medical research initiatives, dozens of causes that would create lasting value instead of temporary luxury. My children were written out completely, not because I stopped loving them, but because love sometimes means protecting people from their own destructive impulses. They'd proven they couldn't handle wealth responsibly. Taking it away might force them to develop character. The lawyers tried to talk me out of such drastic changes. They'll contest the will, Margaret warned. Family members have strong legal standing to challenge inheritance decisions. Let them try, I replied. By the time they're finished fighting their criminal charges, they won't have money for lawyers or credibility with judges. I signed the new will on a bright autumn morning, feeling lighter than I had in years. Camille's meltdown was spectacular. She stormed into my house at midnight, screaming about betrayal and ingratitude. Her designer heels clicked against the marble floors like gunshots as she paced through my living room. "How dare you?" she shrieked, waving her arms like an angry conductor. "After everything we've done for this family, after all our sacrifices, you destroy us over a simple business disagreement? A simple business disagreement." That's how she described their attempt to steal my company and destroy their father's legacy. She grabbed a crystal vase from the mantelpiece and hurled it against the wall, where it shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. "You're a narcissist," she screamed. "A bitter old woman who can't stand to see her children succeed." I didn't yell back. I didn't argue with her twisted logic. I simply walked to my desk, pulled out a legal document, and handed it to her. "What's this?" she demanded, her voice still shaking with rage. "An eviction notice," I said calmly. "You have 30 days to vacate the penthouse apartment you've been living in rent-free for the past 5 years. The silence that followed was beautiful. The press caught wind of the scandal within days. Someone leaked documents to financial journalists, though I never discovered who. Suddenly, business newspapers were running headlines about family betrayal and corporate conspiracy at Russo Industries. The leaked materials painted a devastating picture of my children's activities. Stock price manipulation, embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty. Everything was laid out in excruciating detail. Public relations firms couldn't spin away the documented evidence of their crimes. Camille lost her lucrative endorsement deal with a luxury fashion brand within hours of the first story breaking. The company cited moral turpitude clauses in their contract and demanded repayment of advance fees. Oliver was removed from his position on the board of a prestigious fintech company. The board statement said they couldn't associate with someone under federal investigation for financial crimes. Marcus discovered that his exclusive country club membership had been temporarily suspended pending resolution of the legal proceedings. His private banker called to discuss restructuring his credit arrangements. Their carefully constructed social lives began crumbling as friends and associates distanced themselves from the scandal. Invitations stopped arriving. Phone calls went unreturned. The elite circles they'd valued so highly suddenly wanted nothing to do with them. 2 former employees contacted me directly, offering to testify about my children's misconduct. Both had been fired for refusing to participate in the conspiracy, and both had been keeping detailed records of the illegal activities they'd witnessed. Rebecca Martinez had been our head of internal audit until Oliver terminated her position 6 months earlier. She'd discovered unauthorized transactions and raised his concerns about financial irregularities. When she refused to ignore the problems, she was accused of insubordination and dismissed. James Thompson had managed our government contracts division for 8 years. He'd been pressured to inflate billing statements and manipulate compliance reports. When he threatened to report the violations to federal oversight agencies, Marcus found reasons to eliminate his entire department. Both had been documenting everything, hoping eventually to expose the corruption they'd witnessed. When they learned about the federal investigation, they contacted Margaret with thick files of evidence. I arranged to meet with both of them personally, not just to review their testimony, but to apologize for what my children had put them through. I also hired them back immediately, with full back pay and compensation for the months they'd been unemployed. They became star witnesses in the federal case, their credibility unshakable, because they'd sacrificed their careers to maintain their integrity. My grandchildren begged me to reconsider. They were young adults now, caught between loyalty to their parents and horror at what those parents had done. The oldest, Tyler, came to see me with tears in his eyes. "Grandma, please," he said, his voice breaking. "They made mistakes, but they're still family. You're ruining our future." It broke my heart to see him in pain, but his words revealed how deeply the poison had spread. "I'm not ruining your future," I told him gently. "I'm trying to save it." "How is destroying our parents saving anything?" he demanded. "Because your parents were destroying themselves," I replied, "and they were destroying you in the process. They were teaching you that wealth comes without work, that success comes without integrity, that family means never facing consequences for your actions." He stared at me with confusion and anger. "You're just bitter that we don't need you anymore." "No, sweetheart," I said sadly. "I'm heartbroken that you think needing people is a weakness instead of a strength." The hardest part wasn't fighting my children. It was watching a generation of grandchildren who'd been raised to value comfort over character, inheritance over integrity. I announced my retirement at a press conference in December, 3 months after my birthday disaster. The timing was perfect. The federal investigation had produced its first indictments, the company's stock price had stabilized, and I'd identified my successor. Amanda Chen was a brilliant young woman I'd been mentoring for 15 years. She'd started as an intern, worked her way through every department, and understood both the technical and human sides of our business. More importantly, she shared my values about responsibility and integrity. The press conference was held in our main conference room, with cameras broadcasting live to business networks. I wore my best Navy suit and spoke with the confidence of someone who'd survived 45 years in a brutal industry. "Today, I'm announcing my retirement as CEO of Russo Industries," I began. "I'm proud to transfer leadership to Amanda Chen, whose vision and values will guide our company into the future." I answered questions about the federal investigation, the family scandal, and the transition plans. I was honest about the challenges, but optimistic about our prospects. My children were not present. They were busy meeting with their criminal defense attorneys. Camille filed a lawsuit claiming I'd caused her emotional distress by exposing her crimes and cutting off her financial support. She demanded $10 million in damages for destroying her reputation and career prospects. The lawsuit was embarrassingly amateur. Her lawyers argued that I'd violated her privacy by recording conversations in my own home. They claimed I'd interfered with her business relationships by revealing her criminal activities to law enforcement. They suggested I'd acted out of spite rather than legitimate business concerns. The judge listened to opening arguments with barely concealed irritation. When Camille's attorney finished his presentation, the judge asked, "Are you seriously arguing that exposing criminal activity constitutes emotional distress?" The attorney mumbled something about family loyalty and disproportionate punishment. "Motion dismissed," the judge said sharply. "And I'm ordering the plaintiff to pay defendants' legal fees. This court will not be used as a weapon in family financial disputes." Camille owed my lawyers $60,000. She didn't have it. Her assets had been frozen as part of the federal investigation, and her credit cards had been canceled due to the fraud charges. Justice wasn't always poetic, but sometimes it was mathematically precise. The federal seizure orders came down like winter snow, quietly at first, then all at once. My children's luxury cars were impounded. Their investment properties were placed in receivership. Their art collections and jewelry were cataloged for potential auction. Oliver lost his penthouse apartment, his vacation home in the Hamptons, and his collection of vintage motorcycles. Camille's designer wardrobe was valued at over $200,000 before being seized as proceeds of criminal activity. Marcus had to surrender his yacht, his classic car collection, and his shares in a private jet service. Everything they'd purchased with stolen money became evidence in their criminal trials. They were forced to move into modest rental apartments, sharing space with roommates for the first time since college. No more personal assistants, no more private chefs, no more drivers or housekeepers. Just reality. I felt no satisfaction watching their material lives collapse. but I felt profound relief knowing they could no longer use stolen wealth to insulate themselves from consequences. Maybe poverty would teach them lessons that privilege had failed to provide. Their real education was finally beginning. I wrote each of my children a letter before leaving the country, not to gloat over their downfall, but to free myself from the weight of our broken relationship. The letters were handwritten on personal stationery, each one unique, but carrying the same essential message. I gave you everything I could, and you tried to destroy me for it. You confused love with weakness, generosity with stupidity, and family with ownership. Now I give you nothing, so you may finally have the chance to build something of your own. I didn't apologize for exposing their crimes or cutting off their inheritance, but I did apologize for raising them to believe they were entitled to wealth they hadn't earned and respect they hadn't demonstrated. Your father and I worked 18-hour days to build something meaningful. I wrote, you worked 18-hour days planning to tear it down. The difference between us isn't talent or intelligence, it's character. I sealed the letters and left them with Margaret to deliver after my departure. I didn't want to be present for their reactions. I'd spent enough years managing their emotions. It was time to focus on my own. I moved to a small vineyard in Bordeaux, France, where the morning mist rolls through ancient grapevines and the afternoon sun warms stone walls built centuries ago. My cottage overlooks rolling hills that change color with the seasons. No board meetings, no corporate crises, no family drama, just peace. I planted a garden with my own hands for the first time in decades. Tomatoes and herbs, flowers that bloom in careful succession, fruit trees that won't bear for years to come. Working in soil reminded me why I'd started building things in the first place. Not for money or power, but for the simple satisfaction of creating something valuable. The vineyard owners, Henri and Marie, became my closest friends. They taught me about winemaking, about the patience required to craft something excellent, about the difference between working hard and working frantically. Americans always rush, Henri said one evening as we watched the sunset paint the valley gold. You cannot hurry a good wine. You cannot hurry a good life. I learned French from the village children who giggled at my pronunciation but appreciated my attempts. I read books I'd never had time for, traveled to places I'd only seen in business magazines. Freedom never smelled so sweet. My children thought they were taking my legacy when they tried to steal my company. But my legacy was never the business. It was the principles I'd lived by and the people I'd helped along the way. Those principles couldn't be stolen or sold or seized by federal marshals. They existed in the employees I'd mentored, the innovations we'd created, the communities we'd supported. They lived in Amanda's leadership style, in the scholarships that would educate disadvantaged students, in the research that would improve countless lives. My children are still fighting their legal battles, still learning what it means to face consequences. Oliver works as a junior analyst at a small investment firm. Camille manages social media for a local restaurant chain. Marcus teaches sailing lessons at a community center. They're earning their own money, making their own decisions, building their own reputations. It's the first honest work they've done in decades. Sometimes I wonder if they understand why I did what I did. If they realize that losing everything might have been the only way to find themselves. I sip Bordeaux wine on my terrace each evening, watching the sun set over vineyards that have survived wars and storms and countless human dramas. The vines keep growing, the seasons keep changing, and life keeps moving forward. In the end, I won, not through revenge, but through grace.